Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, especially U.S. Palestinian relations. The Biden administration is on a mission to mend fences with the Palestinians. They are operating under the conviction that the Trump administration was so one-sided vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, the situation itself, that it supported only Israel and totally alienated the Palestinians. Their great gesture to the Palestinians, their peace offering, is a pledge to reopen the United States consulate in Jerusalem. The consulate will serve Palestinians living in Israel. On May 14, 2018, on the Gregorian anniversary corresponding to Jewish anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel, President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The move was decades in the making, and the Palestinians broke off all talks with Israel and with the United States. Biden's White House wants to lure Palestinians back. He wants them back at the negotiating table. He wants them back in the stable of American friends. Not only has the administration pledged the reopening of the consulate, the White House has also begun to reallocate funds to the Palestinians. Nir Barkat, the former mayor of Jerusalem, and he wants to be prime minister also, now a member of the Knesset representing the former ruling Likud party, is putting on the brakes on the Biden administration's plan. Barkat has proposed a bill that would require the government of Israel to approve the opening of all diplomatic missions in Israel. Barkat argues that his bill has a 70% approval rating in the national polls. Moving the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was a huge victory for then President Trump. Along with the move came U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Before the move, in addition to the Tel Aviv Embassy, the United States had two consulates in Jerusalem, one in East Jerusalem and one in West Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the only city in the world with two U.S. consulates. Once upon a time, Berlin had two, but that was different. They were in two different countries, East Berlin and West Berlin. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel reunited the city of Jerusalem, which had been split into East and West during the War of Independence in 1948. From 1948 to 1967, East Jerusalem was part of Jordan, not Israel. The United States had determined that Jerusalem was in dispute, and they did not want to take sides. Hence, the two consulates and the decision to open the United States Embassy in Tel Aviv. So unique was this diplomatic anomaly that the consulate in Jerusalem and the consul general answered to and reported not to the Tel Aviv Embassy and the ambassador there in Tel Aviv, but rather directly to the Secretary of State in Foggy Bottom in Washington. At the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem in 2018, came the simultaneous closing of the two Jerusalem consulates. All consular services were subsumed under the new embassy. Suffice it to say that Jerusalem is a united city in the country of Israel. And with this move by President Trump, even the United States finally recognized that status. Suffice it to say also that this countermove by Barkat against the Biden administration will not be received well in D.C. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has already begun to try to mollify the situation. His office has called the Barkat plan a public relations stunt and said that they do not comment on stunts. The statement was actually, quote, "We don't comment on trolling," unquote. Palestinians point to this move as another tool that Israel is utilizing to hurt Palestinians. For his part, Barkat told Reuters that, quote, "We must do everything we can to maintain the unity of the city of Jerusalem," unquote. His point is that Israel should have the power and the right to consent to open a diplomatic mission for the Palestinians in the city of Jerusalem. The Barkat bill also recognizes that there are a handful of countries with Jerusalem missions, like the former U.S. consulate, that predate Israel's founding in 1948. As grand a gesture as the Biden administration is planning to make, there are U.S. legal issues the White House will have to resolve in order to open a consulate in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, to service the Palestinians. On October 23, 1995, the United States overwhelmingly passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act. In the Senate, the vote was 95-5. In the House, the vote was 374-37. Section 2, Article 1 of the Act says clearly that every country has the right to determine its own capital. Israel will not permit the United States to open a consulate in Jerusalem, its capital, to service Palestinians who live in Israel. It's not simply about redundant services and reproducing services. Doing so would effectively be creating a state entity for Palestinians in Jerusalem. Israel will not let that happen. Israel will say no. The Biden administration chose the wrong move to champion. I've also been thinking about how grateful I am that we now finally have details on the Meron stampede in which 45 people were killed in Israel in April. Details of the worst human catastrophe in modern Israel. Ynet published and leaked protocols of the meeting of the Israeli police top brass and other senior officials indicating that they were aware in advance of all the problems that led to the deadly stampede, and yet they decided not to stop the celebration at Meron. In a meeting on April 19th, officials discussed all the different and complex security issues pertaining to the event, including COVID-19 restrictions, crowd control, and securing the access routes to the tomb site. Ynet has compiled some of the main points raised by the police higher-ups in the damning document. These are the pertinent components of the meeting as quoted by Ynet. Police Northern District Commander Major General Shimon Lavi, who oversaw the event on the ground, remains the only official to publicly take responsibility for the tragedy. However, the protocols show that Israel's top cop, Police Commissioner Yaakov Shabbatai, was the one who pushed to authorize the mass event without any restrictions on the number of parishioners allowed on the mountain. Shabbatai and others at the meeting recognized the dangers entailed in allowing large masses of people to pass through the tomb site's narrow walkways, all at the same time. In fact, Shabbatai is quoted as saying, and here's the quote, "These issues require concentration of effort and attention in the preparation in light of the large number of participants in a small and limited space and the tangible danger to human life," unquote. Wow. Northern District Commander Lavi was the only official present at the meeting who pushed to put a cap on the number of participants allowed on the mountain concurrently. During the meeting, Lavi said, "I recommend an outline allowing 10,000 people to enter the mountain at any given moment. The outline is challenging, but we must make a decision," he said. Another official who sounded the alarm about the potential disaster was then head of Police Operations Department, Major General Amnon Alkalai, who pointed out that the site's rickety infrastructure and issued a call to prepare for a potential mass casualty event. Alkalai also admitted that the police would have been unable to enforce coronavirus restrictions at the packed festival if any had in fact been imposed. Alkalai said, and here's a quote again, "Israel police will not be able to meet the restrictions, choosing between safety and health. Safety comes first, and preventing overcrowding would serve both purposes," unquote. And that's not all. Then, Israel Police legal advisor Ayelet Eliashar and Human Resources Department Chief Major General Boaz Goldberg joined Alkalai's warnings and said that enforcing such measures would not be feasible. In the end, all fears were realized. 45 people were dead. Countless others will carry emotional scars throughout their lives. Coming up next, Points of View. As I promised I would do last week, I want to continue developing the idea of Jewish leadership. Last week, I referenced and discussed an op-ed written and published in Ukrainian media by Israeli President Isaac Herzog. This week, I want to look at the President's address to the JFNA-GA, that is the Jewish Federations of North America General Assembly. It was obviously done on Zoom. The presentation was virtual. In his presentation, President Herzog spoke of the relationship, the function and the dysfunction between Israel and the diaspora. He said, "I cannot imagine a world in which the two epic centers of Judaism function in solitude and disconnect, without working to build bridges back to each other." President Herzog said, "As we contemplate what's next for the future of the Jewish community, outside this tight circle, the core commitment to Jewish peoplehood is under threat. No matter how we break down the numbers, there is no doubt that being Jewish and love of Israel is becoming a challenging, complex issue for some in the young generation of North American Jews. It is almost too painful to express aloud, but an increasing number of young Jews no longer feel a bond with the Jewish collective. To many, American Jewish Jews are disinterested in what being Jewish means and in the complex understanding of the realities and challenges facing Israel. And some of them, a very small minority, are too willing to accept distorted labels and libels against the Jewish state. After describing American Jewish disinterest in Israel, Herzog explains that Israelis have no interest in diaspora either. No doubt, he explained, Israel and the diaspora are growing apart. Herzog said, at the same time, on the other side of the ocean, far too many Israelis show little interest in Jewish life outside of Israel and lack a nuanced understanding of their sisters and brothers in the diaspora. Here we are among friends, so let me be clear. As I have repeatedly stated on numerous occasions, the two epic centers of Jewish life, what I term as Jerusalem and Babylon, are under threat of growing apart. Right now, today, we must declare our urgent duty of overreaching goal to strengthen our shared sense of peoplehood, to enhance and deepen the links between us. I cannot imagine a world in which Israel and North American Jewry are not intimately tied to each other. And I say this at a time when many Jews face hatred and anti-Semitism also in the United States. I cannot imagine the Jewish people who are not responsible for each other, a people whose prayers do not include each other, for whom the axiom of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, all of Israel are responsible for one another, is hollow. I cannot imagine that. Herzog's refrain throughout this speech is, I cannot imagine the Jewish world. I cannot imagine the Jewish people. But unfortunately, that which he cannot imagine is the reality. The bigger question is, how can that be changed? He continues, I cannot imagine a Jewish world vacant of community and solidarity. I cannot imagine a world in which Jews in North America are fearful of living publicly as Jews and experience attacks and intimidation, at times in college, at times in their synagogues and elsewhere. And the Jewish collective, as well as Israelis, do not feel compelled to act immediately on their behalf. Just as I cannot imagine a world in which the existence of Israel is in question. And American Jews do not defend the state of Israel. And then President Herzog added, as President of the State of Israel, I will make it my mission to strengthen the lines of communication, to reinforce the underlying bond and the mutual responsibility. As President, I will act with every group, every individual, every denomination to ensure that North American Jewry knows that Israel is your home away from home, and to ensure that the Israeli people accept and respect every Jewish voice. Herzog concluded this address by emphasizing the need to bring about change. He said, the challenges are tremendous, but the vision for overcoming them is equally great. And preserving the bonds of our peoplehood is the key to a Jewish future. This is the challenge of our generation. From the depths of my heart, I believe that if we remain committed to our shared peoplehood, joined by bonds mighty enough to withstand the winds and storms of disagreement, we will be able to change the tide to strengthen Jewish identity and peoplehood and seize tremendous opportunities together. We can and must do this together. This is an important speech. There's no doubt about it. It is essential that a leader like Herzog takes the bull by the horns and is unafraid to discuss this rift. Herzog recognized, validated the existence of diaspora Jews. That is a big deal and is more than just a good start. Now he needs to really push hard to move ahead. An excellent piece. Next up is a column from Arutz Sheva that was published October 27, 2021. The author is Moshe Phillips. The title of the column is Jewish Nose, Jokes Aren't Funny, in fact they're dangerous. Subtitle, in the Muslim world today, caricatures of Jews with stereotypical noses regularly appear in viciously anti-Israel editorial cartoons. Moshe Phillips raises an essential issue. He looks at the phenomenon of the Jewish nose. He gives 3 examples of how people laughed at Jewish noses and 3 examples of very different responses. This is how Phillips begins. A political candidate in Virginia, a television game show host, and the Washington, D.C. historian seem to think that jokes about Jewish noses are funny. They're not. In fact, they're dangerous. In Virginia, Hans Copeland, a Republican candidate for the House of Delegates, last week mocked the size of a Jewish delegate's nose. Earlier this year, Mike Richards, the new host of Jeopardy, was revealed to have made a joke about a Jewish woman's nose. And then there's Dr. Rebecca Erbilding, a staff historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., who tweeted in 2019, quote, At a talk today, asked about my personal background, I confessed that I am not Jewish, but with a Hebrew first name, a German last name, and my nose and hair, I pass, unquote. First, he set the stage, and now Phillips tells us the consequences of making these Jewish nose comments. Philip is 100% correct in his analysis and his critique. He writes, "It's instructive to see how each of these controversies played out. Richards apologized, but was fired from Jeopardy anyway. Copeland apologized, but denied his slur was anti-Semitic. Erbelding has never apologized at all. In fact, she hasn't even acknowledged the public's legitimate concerns about what she wrote. Producers were right to oust Richards and to replace him with a committed Jew, actress Mayim Bialik. That sent a message to the public that anti-Semitism can't be washed away with an apology. The Virginia Republican candidate's apology was unacceptable. Saying you're sorry but then denying you did anything wrong is not saying you're sorry at all." The Holocaust Museum's historian's response has been the worst of all. Dr. Elberding's refusal to address the controversy, much less apologize, is an insult to the public which pays her salary. For a government-funded institution to have on its staff someone who jokes about Jewish noses is an embarrassment. For a Holocaust museum which is devoted to teaching about the horrific consequences of anti-Semitism, it's positively shameful. Phillips proceeds to explain that the Jewish nose is one of the oldest stereotypes of Jews. He writes, "The danger of the Jewish nose stereotype dare not be underestimated. The notion that there is a distinctive Jewish nose is one of the oldest anti-Jewish myths. Jewish haters invented it in the 12th century as a way to single out Jews for contempt. Government propagandists in Nazi Germany often used the Jewish nose stereotype in their hate-mongering. A notorious Nazi film in 1940 called The Eternal Jew, which claimed to expose the real Jew, focused again and again on Jewish faces, zooming in on their noses to make Jews seem repulsive. Images of big-nosed Jews appeared frequently in the Hitler regime's news media, cultural publications and children's books. Der Giftblitz, anti-Jewish children's book published by Julius Streicher, who was also the publisher of the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer, featured a section called How to Tell a Jew. It showed a 7th grade boys' class in which Karl Schultz, a small lad in the front row, stepped to the chalkboard and proclaimed, 'One most easily tell a Jew by his nose.' The Jewish nose is bent at its point. It looks like the number 6. We call it the Jewish 6. In much of the Muslim world today, caricatures of Jews and stereotypical noses regularly appear in viciously anti-Zionist, anti-Israel editorial cartoons. Whether told by a co-worker at the water cooler or schoolyard bully, a celebrity or museum historian, jokes about Jewish noses deserve the public scorn, and there must be consequences. Well, I hope that people take this column to heart. It's certainly worthwhile. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 5 cartoons today, and memes. The first cartoon is simply a play on words, and sometimes we just need to laugh. There is a humongous plume of black smoke. Something is burning, and it looks serious. Cars on the highway approaching the smoke pass a sign that reads, Museum of Fire. The caption reads, "This museum looks legit." The next is actually a tweet, and it pokes fun at the fact that Facebook went down across the world. And when that happened, people went berserk. The tweet reads, "Facebook has been down for an hour. Since then, I've written 7 chapters, 3 conference papers, cleaned 4 houses, taught 12 courses, and made dinner for the rest of the year." The humor is not lost. I do not engage with Facebook. I think it simply sucks time out of the day. But I am the minority. Next up is a meme poking fun at Facebook going down again. The twist here is that it is also a play on the famous speech from Star Wars, in which Obi-Wan Kenobi speaks about evil engulfing the world. He says, I felt a great disturbance in the force, as if millions of pointlessly bickering voices on Facebook suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. Missing from this quote is Obi-Wan's conclusion, which it was, as if something terrible has happened. But that part of the quote does not work as a critique for people who are so addicted to Facebook. The next two cartoons are from the Palestinian Media Watch. I use them often. They monitor the Palestinian media and report on their many violations. They report to the UN, the EU, to Congress, to whoever will listen. This first cartoon comes from the PA website. It takes Hamas to task for using children as human shields while they attack Israel with rockets. With a baby on its shield, a Hamas fighter is throwing a rocket. This next cartoon is even more biting. I'm translating from the Arabic. The fancy person with the suit and the white shirt is Hamas. That's what it says on his jacket, Hamas. He's holding up two fingers in the shape of a V for victory. His other arm is over the shoulder of a man wearing a keffiyeh. Written on that man's jacket is the Palestinian people. The man from Hamas is holding a target right over the heart of the Palestinian people. The message is that Hamas is targeting the Palestinian people. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. I watched and I was stunned. In a video conference, the UN Human Rights Council listened to UN Watch Executive Director Hillel Neurer as he spoke about how teachers and principals at United Nations schools are posting and teaching hatred of Israel and of Jews, and teaching an appreciation of Hitler.
Madam President, is UNRWA supporting peace? Let us consider UN Watch's recent report on the teachers they hire by looking at their social media. Nahed Sharawi, an UNRWA math teacher in Gaza, posted a video of Adolf Hitler, along with quotes to enrich and enlighten your thoughts and minds. Hosni Masri, an UNRWA teacher in the West Bank, posted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about how Jews control the world, created the coronavirus, and seek to destroy Islam.
The president of the UNHRC, Nazat Shamim Khan, cut Neurer off and said he was out of order. She said that his comments were insulting and offensive.
Esra Abdul-Rahim,
I asked the Secretary to pause this video. I have noticed that in the course of this video, derogatory, insulting, and inflammatory remarks have been made, which in particular refer directly to specific individuals. This amounts to personal attacks against those individuals, and it is not acceptable in this forum. This statement is out of order, and I give the floor to the next speaker, the Palestinian Return Center Limited.
Neurer's watchdog group documented over 100 teachers and principals in UN schools violating their neutrality. They praised and even advocated killing Israelis on social media. The UNHRC is an independent body. The Secretary General of the United Nations has only very limited influence over the Council. There has been almost no outcry on this blatant misuse of power. That is inexcusable. The Czech Republic will buy a new air defense system from Israel. The new Israeli system will be used to replace their 50-year-old Soviet air defense system. This is over a $500 million deal, and it is clearly demonstrating that Israel is making headway into NATO nations when it comes to arms sales. Although exact details of the numbers are secret, it looks like Rafael Industries, one of Israel's arms manufacturers, will provide the Czech Republic with 4 mid-range anti-missile batteries, as well as command and control units. The system is designed to protect cities and nuclear facilities. Slovakia, another NATO nation, has placed another order with Israel for similar defense weapons, mostly radar and control devices. The story of Ran Arad is back in the news. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett told Israelis that the Mossad was launching a serious investigation to find out what happened to Ran Arad. The story of Ran Arad has been hanging over and haunting Israel for 35 years. In 1986, Arad, an IDF navigator, ejected from his jet and landed behind enemy lines in Lebanon. He was captured by the Amal militia and never again heard from or found. His body was never returned to Israel. In a speech to the Knesset during the opening of the winter session, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said, "It was a complex, large-scale, daring operation. That's all there is to say right now. We made another effort on the way to understanding what happened to Ran," unquote. After an Israeli columnist claimed that the current operation endangered lives, Arad's widow, Tammy, defended the operation and said that she was specifically told that no lives were endangered. Israel has already discovered the first place where Ron Arad was held. The search for answers continues. Israel's coronavirus cabinet voted to scrap the rule which put a ceiling on the number of people who could sit outside in cafes and restaurants. But there is a caveat. They decided to scrap the policy only as long as the tables were separated from each other by 150 centimeters, which would mean about 5 feet apart. The decision to change the policy is significant. It frees up restaurants and it follows the science. More than that, it is a resounding acceptance of the thinking that there is a very little chance that COVID transmission when you're outside. Also on Israel and COVID, Israel's COVID positivity numbers are dropping and dropping. Obviously, this is very good news. It is not all good news, though. 17% of Israelis are unvaccinated. And as expected, the overwhelming percentage of those people being hospitalized are unvaccinated. Unvaccinated Israelis compose 70% of those people in the hospital. 23% of the hospitalized, by the way, received 2 vaccines already over the last 6 months, or over 6 months ago, I should say. Surprisingly, 4% of the hospitalized victims are also those who got the 3rd vaccine, the booster. This next number is very disturbing, and it is growing. 44% of those testing positive are children under 11 years old. Some of them are very sick and even dying. And that goes against conventional wisdom. The COVID virus of 20 months ago is not the COVID virus of today. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that there is a long history of having 2 centers of Jewish life? While it's true that one center was always higher, the other still existed and was also competing. In recent years, ever since the creation of the State of Israel, Israel has been the main center, the more exalted center, and the United States has been the other. While the United States was strong and at times even eclipsed Israel in certain fields of Jewish thought and Jewish life, the vast amount of Jewish creativity continued to come from Israel, and still does. In the time of the Babylonian Talmud, Bavel was the stronger center, while Jerusalem was less vibrant. The Mishnah, let's say for instance, was a product of the land of Israel. But there are 2 Talmuds, or Gemaras. There is a Talmud from the land of Israel called Talmud Yerushalmi, and there's a Talmud from Babylonia, which is called Talmud Bavli. Comparing these 2 great works is a fascinating exercise in Jewish learning. Suffice it to say, hands down, the Babylonian Talmud is the text more often studied. The essential part of this dynamic is that diaspora and Israel need to have a symbiotic relationship. They need it in order to grow. They need it in order to survive. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.